Hello, my name is Norman Sandridge. I'm an associate professor of classics at Howard University and an ongoing fellow at the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C. My talk for this conference on teaching leaders and leadership through classics is entitled How Contemporary Leaders Study Ancient Leadership, Pitfalls and Prospects. For this talk, I want to pose a basic question. How do we know when a person's leadership has been improved by studying the ancient world? We can all think of examples of famous people, many of them leaders, who actually studied classics. But what we don't know exactly is to what extent did their study of classics actually translate into better leadership. We also know that there are numerous books written written for leaders with examples of lessons to be learned from ancient leadership. There are also a number of books with case studies on leaders that we might want to emulate. There's also a fairly straightforward argument to be made that studying the ancient world teaches you emotional intelligence. It teaches you things like empathy and perspective taking, self-awareness, self-regulation, and even other social skills. And it's also pretty obvious that emotional intelligence is necessary for, if not sufficient for, good leadership. But what I want to push us to think about today is an example of a prominent contemporary leader who has studied ancient leadership and been improved by it. And of course, part of what we'll be thinking about is what it exactly means to study ancient leadership and what kinds of improvements do we have in mind. But the way I want to frame this conversation here is by looking at three examples that I think are examples of not good cases of contemporary leaders studying or engaging with ancient leadership. And my hope is by looking at the negative examples, we can get a clearer and clearer picture of what really constructive and positive ancient leadership study would look like for contemporary leaders. And the three examples that I want to use with you here come first from Michael Dukakis, going back 30 years in 1988 when he was the Democratic nominee for a president at the National Convention in Atlanta. He gave his acceptance speech that culminated with a reference to ancient Athens, particularly to the marathon and to something that he calls the Athenian pledge, or an Athenian pledge that he believes was given on occasions like his acceptance speech. And I'm going to read the quote to you very quickly, and then talk about what I see as a pitfall here for engaging with ancient leadership. So the quote reads from Dukakis: "As I accept your nomination tonight, I can't help recalling that the first marathon was run in ancient Greece, and that on important occasions like this one, the people of Athens would complete their ceremonies by taking a pledge. That pledge, that covenant, is as eloquent and timely today as it was 2,000 years ago. We will never bring disgrace to this our country by any act of dishonesty or of cowardice. We will fight for the ideals of this our country. We will revere and obey the law. We will strive to quicken our sense of civic duty. Thus, in all these ways, we will transmit this country greater, stronger, and prouder and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. This is my pledge to you, my fellow Democrats, and this is my pledge to you, my fellow Americans." End quote. So it's fairly straightforward, rhetorically speaking, what Dukakis, I think, is trying to accomplish here. He's an American with Greek ancestry, and he's connecting himself to an ancient past that many Americans at the time, of course, would have regarded as part of their own cultural patrimony. By mentioning marathon or the running of the marathon, he's hinting at the fact that he himself would have the stamina and the vigor to carry on the campaign until November, of course. But the reality is, a lot of what Dukakis is referencing here regarding the ancient world is very vague, if not very misleading. The marathon was not run as a race until the Olympic Games were revived in 1896. What happened in the ancient world, we think, we're not sure, was that a man by the name of Philippides or Pheidippides ran from the city of Marathon to Athens, approximately 25 or 26 miles. He ran to announce the Athenian victory, the victory of Athens and her allies over the Persians in a decisive battle in 490 BCE. More importantly, this oath, or this pledge, as Dukakis calls it, that he references, is a paraphrase from something in the ancient world known as the Ephebic oath. This was an oath that ancient Athenian males would take in their late teens, in part of the initiation into a 2-year service of primarily military training for becoming a full-fledged Athenian citizen. The system is called the Ephebeia. It's a system for youths on the cusp of adulthood. And again, Dukakis' version of this oath is completely watered down. It leaves out the militaristic component, the deeply religious component of the oath, and even the oath has vows of obedience to those in charge. And so all Dukakis is basically doing is acting like he's reviving an ancient custom, but in the vaguest and most watered down kind of way. The second example that I want to look at with you is like the first one in the sense that it's from an actual president. This is President Trump just this last March appropriating another ancient leader here known as Cyrus the Great in what Trump claims is an actual quotation from Trump. He's delivering a message to Iranians on the occasion of the Iranian New Year, the Persian New Year known as Nowruz, and he wants to give an uplifting message and connect with them, probably on the basis of his own leadership style. And he's saying here, and I quote, Cyrus the Great, a leader of the ancient Persian Empire, famously said that freedom, dignity, and wealth together constitute the greatest happiness of humanity. If you bequeath all three to your people, their love for you will never die. End quote. So while this quote may sound heartwarming and inspiring to people today, it may even be a good quote, it's not actually a quote from Cyrus the Great. In fact, it was very quickly discovered to those outside the study of the ancient world that this quote was a paraphrase of a 4th century biography, pseudo-biography of Cyrus the Great by an Athenian man named Xenophon. And Xenophon's own biography of Cyrus the Great is really anything but a biography. It's itself really just meant to be an inspiring guide for a would-be leader. But the quotes there that are attributed to Cyrus aren't actually from Cyrus. And moreover, the paraphrase of Xenophon isn't of Cyrus, and the paraphrase of the paraphrase is not from Cyrus either. But this is again an example of a contemporary leader misusing, really misinterpreting the ancient sources about a leader, and it may have an even more concerning subtext to it in the sense that Trump has already been likened in evangelical circles to Cyrus, as almost though he is the second coming of Cyrus to sort of save the world. So this may be a part of Trump's own propaganda to link himself to the first king of the Persian Empire from the 6th century BCE. Now, in these two examples that we've looked at so far, arguably this doesn't even really constitute a modern prominent leader studying ancient leadership. Neither Dukakis nor Trump seem to have engaged with the ancient sources much at all. In fact, Dukakis's paraphrase of the Ephebic Oath seems to be itself a paraphrase of a modern paraphrase of the Ephebic Oath. So it's really twice removed from its ancient source. And as we said, there is no real ancient source for a quotation on Cyrus, but the ancient source, which is itself not an accurate reflection of the real Cyrus, has now been 3 times or is 2 times paraphrased on top of the source. The last example that I want to focus on here just briefly comes from someone who did seriously engage with an ancient leader, and the example I'm thinking of is of Joe Paterno, the former head coach of the Penn State football team, who was a storied and heroic leader until his reputation was forever tainted by the fact that he turned a blind eye to a sexual abuse scandal by his defensive coordinator, Jerry Sandusky. And I want to use this next example both as a case of someone who does deeply engage with ancient leadership, but ultimately fails perhaps to learn the best lessons that leadership may have taught. So in the case of Paterno, he read Virgil's Aeneid in Latin when he was in high school with one of his instructors that he formed a very special and enduring bond with. And the power that this ancient epic of the Aeneid had, or the influence it had over Paterno, really can't be overestimated, at least in Paterno's own language. And I want to read a quote here about that. Paterno says, "The adventure of Aeneas seeped into far corners of my mind, into my feelings about what is true and honorable and important. They helped shape everything I have since become. I don't think anybody can get a handle on what it makes me tick as a person, and certainly can't get at the roots of how I coach football without understanding what I learned from the deep relationship with Virgil during those afternoons." End quote. Okay, so to me, it's very interesting to wonder whether or not Paterno turned a blind eye to the Sandusky scandal despite his reading of the Aeneid or because of his reading of the Aeneid. And the reason I say despite his reading of the Aeneid, in the later books of the Aeneid, Aeneas forms a very close relationship with a young man by the name of Pallas. And the relationship is so sacred and so close that when Pallas is killed by Aeneas's rival Turnus, Aeneas goes into a rage. He becomes furious, and the epic concludes with Aeneas's righteous vengeance upon Turnus for the killing, basically Aeneas's charge of a young man. And Aeneas even channels the spirit of Pallas when he is killing Turnus. He says, "Pallas is the one who slays you, who sacrifices you here with this wound." So there was precedent in the Aeneid for Paterno to have reflected on and thought about his duty or his responsible to a young man who was being threatened or who was in trouble. And for whatever reason, he did not, that part of the Aeneid did not resonate with him. And as I say, it's interesting to wonder if perhaps because of a certain reading of the Aeneid, Paterno may have turned a blind eye. Maybe it is the case that Paterno saw himself very much as an Aeneas figure, and he saw his legacy at Penn State as part of his own kind of founding of Rome, and that it was just collateral damage that others might have to suffer and be dehumanized as a result of that empire building. Okay, so from those 3 examples, I want to just briefly summarize what I see as some of the major pitfalls when contemporary leaders engage with ancient leadership. One is that it's very easy to misconstrue and misinterpret the ancient material. 2, It's very easy to find oneself being flattered by the ancient material and to use the ancient material in a very fanciful and careless way to prop up one's own ego or to legitimize oneself as a leader. 3, it may simply be the case that we can't always apply all the lessons of ancient leadership at once or in a timely way, and the lessons again may be contradictory. And 4, the part of the subtext of all of this is when we sit down to talk about contemporary leaders reading ancient leadership, we almost always think of men doing this, and we really need to envision, we need to make way for prominent contemporary women to be engaging with this material and having their own leadership being informed in a positive way by that. Okay, I want to conclude now by just saying 2 things. There are 2 kind of extreme temptations one might have in reflecting on these pitfalls. 1, we might want to simply insist that anybody has to get a PhD in classics and be able to read Greek and Latin and all the critical theory that goes along with it in order to seriously be improved by ancient leadership study. This would mean also, as I say, taking up critical approaches that would inform you and remind you that even in reading of Virgil's Aeneid, there are traditions of scholarship that see a subversive or a more sober look at the glorious rise of the Roman Empire, and make us aware that Virgil may be very concerned for the suffering and the dehumanization that can occasion the quest for empire, so much so that it may call into question the very value of seeking an empire. Okay, so that's one tendency, get a PhD in classics. Obviously, no one is going to take that seriously now. It's arrogant, it's presumptuous, it's wrong to assume that the ancient world has all there is to say about what it means to be a good leader. And just no one is going to, very few people are going to have the time to do this. On the flip side, we might argue that maybe ancient leadership study can be more like reception study, where you basically just engage with the material on your own terms. If you misinterpret it, if you misconstrue it, you just call that inspiration. You just say it informs the decisions that you're making now in whatever way possible, and call it a day. It's no big deal. One of the reasons I would not call ancient leadership study the same thing as reception studies is because in reception studies, or think of a contemporary movie like The 300, most people are used to the idea that it's not going to accurately reflect ancient reality. But that's not the case in ancient leadership study, or when a contemporary leader draws from the ancient world. Part of the rhetorical force of part of the reason it has rhetorical force is because they're claiming that this was an ancient reality, and by reviving this ancient reality, the modern world will be improved by it. So unless a leader is going to introduce the caveat that this is just an interpretation and it may not be based on reality at all, ancient leaders or modern leaders cannot think of themselves simply as doing reception studies. At the end of the day, whatever our formula for responsible ancient leadership study looks like, we want to make sure that it is a faithful representation of that ancient reality. And it may be the case that that ancient reality is just there to help us think not about the answers to questions, but the many different ways that questions might be answered. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.